Chuka, Umunna, first of all, is the Remain campaign, as Michael Gove says, treating people like mere children, capable of being frightened into obedience by conjuring up this new bogeyman every night?
No, and really, if anyone's conjuring up anything, it's the Leave campaign conjuring up this conspiracy. Of course, look, politicians like me and Dominic, we have a particular view. We're certainly not impartial. We want our side to win. But there are also a whole bank of independent people, from the IMF to unions like Unison and Unite, who argue that we're better off in. Now, if you listen to the Leave campaign, they would have you believe that Len McCluskey of Unite has come together with Dave Prentice of Unison, is working in cahoots with that band of socialists at the IMF and the CBI. Of course, this is all orchestrated by President Obama on George Osborne's behalf to oppose Brexit, which, of course, is ridiculous. It's pure fantasy.
Right. So are you then indulging in fantasy politics, conjuring up conspiracies while accusing the other side of conjuring up the bogeyman?
No, but look, I mean, we've got cross-party consensus. We've got unions like the RMT very much on the left, right the way through to economists like Andrew Lillico or Nigel Lawson, former Thatcherite Chancellor, making the case throughout. The truth is there's a risk-reward calculation, if you like, on both sides. And what Michael Gove wants to do is say, hold on a minute here. You guys talking about the risks of leaving the EU. Look at the risks of staying in with the Eurozone crisis, the chaos on the borders. But he's also critically today set out the positive vision outside of the EU.
What was the positive vision? Because the majority of what I heard Michael Gove say this morning...
Well, neither of you listened to the whole speech.
Well, I listened to some speech, but I did hear the interview this morning, saying that actually it was all about the fear of staying in.
Well, no. Take your time, go and have a read of the whole thing. It repays it. So, first of all, there is no lottery ticket staying in the EU or being outside. It is about the balance of risk and reward. But what he set out is the brighter prospects outside of the EU. So, for example, the ability to control our own regulation. Now, you can take different views on that, but it has a huge impact, EU regulation, on small businesses. The EU Commission concedes it hits small businesses 10 times as hard as normal businesses. Now, in this country, small businesses create 85% of the new jobs. Secondly, he's talked about the brighter prospects if we're independent, free to trade more energetically from Latin America to Asia. The truth is the EU has been a very poor negotiator of free trade agreements, doesn't have a free trade agreement with a single big economy. Now, look, we can argue about this, but there are a whole range of positive opportunities being outside of the EU that people like Chuka and the In campaign totally discard.
Well, isn't that the problem for the Remain campaign, that actually they could talk about Project Fear too on the Leave side, but this idea of a brighter future, of change, of optimism, of looking beyond what we have now, does feel an easier case to argue in a more passionate way than for the status quo, which is much more difficult when you are relying on what some people might argue are establishment bodies and institutions like the IMF, for example.
Well, I think Len McCluskey and Dave Prentice might have something to say about that. But look, I don't buy this idea that we get trampled over by our partners in the European Union and that we don't get our way. In 9 out of 10 times we're on the majority side when there are votes on the European Council. And also this would tend to suggest that somehow things are imposed from on high, that we don't have a role to play in the rules and regulations that come out of it. But I see this in perhaps bigger terms, because I think we're dealing with a lot of cross-border issues, whether it's terror or the environmental catastrophe that's unfolding as we see climate change. Those things don't know any borders. Really, the only way I think you can deal with those things is at a supranational level, and particularly when you're looking, and of course Paul's written a lot about this, at the power of multinational companies which seek to play different jurisdictions against each other, saying, look, if you don't adopt the lower level of labour protections in that country, we're going to take our business elsewhere. And what actually the European Union enables us to do is set minimum standards and prevent that race to the bottom.
Right, we'll come back to security, and I will come back to it in just a moment, because one of the big problems for Leave is, what does it look like? That's the question that keeps being repeatedly posed, because you can paint a picture, but you don't have a document. Rightly or wrong, you don't have a document to actually answer some of the questions.
We can't negotiate with the EU before the referendum.
Well, no, but hang on.
It's an Aunt Sally, isn't it?
Right, but let me finish the question.
You can at least provide an alternative.
Well, we have.
Right, but you haven't in quite the same terms, and I'm not saying that that's a criticism, but there wasn't a document to put through, because so you are, in certain terms, arguing for something that may happen, but you don't know for sure.
Well,
and
so
that is the problem.
Campaign.
Well, that is the problem. Well, except you could argue that they're arguing for something that is already here.
We know.
No. This is the big myth.
We know what it looks like.
Look at the Eurozone crisis.
I mean,
look at the way it's
Norway,
unfolding.
Canada,
Look
which
at
is the model
chaos on
you
our
want.
borders. The EU feels like it's in a permanent state of crisis.
But hang on,
so the truth
you
is,
talk to
there is far greater uncertainty around the prospects of the EU than there are in making, modestly but in clear ways, the very concrete areas where actually we can change things, like border controls, which Chuka is...
Well, you say it's ridiculously sick. You couldn't
crisis.
anticipate the migration crisis in the way it's unfolded.
No, you couldn't.
And it has, and the EU has not been able to deal with it.
Or the Eurozone crisis.
Or the Eurozone
Jo,
crisis.
that migration crisis would be there, notwithstanding whether the EU existed or not. Where is it coming
One
from?
might say if the EU couldn't deal with a migration crisis on its
You
borders, then
don't
what do
think
you
that
deal with?
borderless Europe is having any pull factor on the migration crisis?
Hang on just a minute.
Is that what you're saying, Chuka?
Hang on just a minute. Let me finish my sentence and I might answer Jo's question. But if you look at what is driving the migration crisis, we've had growing jihadism in Africa. Largely, there are quite a lot of numbers coming into the EU zone from Africa, and also the problems in the Middle East. Now, those things would subsist whether we were in or out of the European Union. Now, am I going to argue, and look, I'm by no means saying the European Union is perfect, and of course it needs reform. And by the way, you can only reform it if you're at the table, not if you're outside of the room.
But what about the Eurozone crisis? You couldn't have predicted that in the way it unfolded either.
Thankfully,
we were part of the Eurozone.
We're not in the Eurozone.
But George Osborne did say repeatedly we did feel buffeted by that crisis.
Well, this goes to the heart of one of the Leave campaign's biggest weaknesses, in my view, because they say, look, if we leave, we'll be able to be part of the single market. So we'll have all the benefits, but we will not have to pay a fee,
yes,
and we won't be subject to any of the rules that come with being part of that single market. No country outside of the EU has that kind of arrangement. And why would members, the members we leave in the EU, why would they give us a deal that they haven't even given themselves? And that is the big problem with Michael Gove's speech.
And many German and French ministers have articulated that argument.
Well,
Dominic Raab, I would just put to you, though, so that viewers can listen to what some of the ministers said. Emmanuel Macron, the French economy minister, suggested on the Andrew Marr show that Britain would be completely killed in trade talks if the country chose to leave the EU. I'm not saying he's right, but this is the response we're getting at the moment. And maybe they would say that at this stage because they don't want Britain to leave the EU. But you do have to ask yourself, if you want a deal, a trade deal, with all the pluses and all the advantages and none of the tariffs, none of the quid pro quo of freedom of movement, why would they give it?
So let me answer that question. First of all, on Monsieur Macron, I hope he keeps talking every week in this country on this debate.
You think it'll bring more people to your side?
The idea that Britain would be apocalyptically off the cliff edge if we left the EU is silly. Neither the head of the CBI, neither Britain's ambassador to the EU, formerly Lord Kerr, nor the Prime Minister takes that position. There are risk reward ratios whether we're in or out. The reason why I think we would retain a strong trading relationship with fifth biggest economy in the world. The EU firms sell us £60 billion more in goods and services than we sell them. There is a strong mutual interest. The only reason that we would be in trouble outside is if the EU is going to behave in an utterly vindictive, spiteful way that ran against its own interests. And I would say this, Chuka, is that the kind of club we really want to be a part of?
Look, hang on just a minute. I'm not saying, let's be clear about this, because there's a bit of a straw man argument here. I'm not saying that we wouldn't be able to trade either with our European partners or others.
That there would be a deal to be done.
It's a question of the terms. And by the way, I mean, in terms of the kind of risk-reward and balance thing that Dominic talks about, 44% of our exports go to the EU. On average, if you look at the other 27 member states, just 5% of their exports come to the UK. But that's because we're one and they're
28. That's the total.
But the point is, for us, we have far more to lose from an import-export perspective.
Economically literate.
Let Chuka finish his point and I'll come back to you.
On world trade, the other way.
Hang on just a minute. On world trade, I led a trade delegation to Beijing in 2013. And you know what the Chinese said to me? And I went to the international department of the Communist Party, as you do when you're in China. And they could not. They said to me, look, we don't understand why are there some people who want to leave the European Union in your country, because when you negotiate with us, whatever it may be, intellectual property, a big concern of small businesses trading in China, they said you're sitting on one half of the table with 500 million other people negotiating with us on our 1.3 billion. Why do you want to go and sit in the corner on your own?
I've got to bring Paul Mason in though.
Can I just ask about China?
Very quickly.
Why does, in that case, the EU not have a trade deal with China, but Switzerland does?
Right.
Well,
Switzerland, of course, has a deal. But
It's in the
Switzerland
process
has a deal that Michael Gove doesn't want to emulate. I got the impression
Well, it's a
from what
quarter
you
of our
said.
size.
So, right, hang on.
We've surely got bigger economic clout than Switzerland.
Paul Mason, let's just interrupt this flow just for a moment. On the figures, when we talk about the Leave campaign quoting £350 million that has been argued against, in fact, that we pay, they say, to the EU, and we hear that households would be worse off, even if not individually, but to the tune of £4,300 a week. Does that resonate with the public?
Well, look, it doesn't resonate with me because I've been on the receiving end of so many Treasury, Office for Budget Responsibility and Bank of England reports where you can't see the inner workings that I never trust them. I mean, the idea that you could put a figure on it per family is ridiculous. And I think, look, the Brexit debate will be about principle. And I actually am convinced of the principle that Michael Gove outlined there, that the European Union is not democratic and is incapable of becoming democratic. That's why philosophically I would support Brexit. My only problem is that what we've been going on to here, what is the proposal? Gove says we're like a hostage in the back of the EU's car. I don't want to be a hostage in the back of the car of Michael Gove and Boris Johnson. And given the choice on the 23rd of June, I think Brexit will happen anyway for the reasons, well, David Cameron suggests. Because we got a deal in Brussels that we're already half out, and the Eurozone will come together, and in 10 years we'll be out. I just don't want to come out with an ultra-right-wing Tory government and no chance for the left, no chance for social democracy to have its say within what.
But isn't the point that outside
and isn't
of the
that the problem for actually attracting enough voters to your side then? If people on Paul Mason's side of the argument,
you know, the co-chair of the Out campaign, Vote Leave, is Gisela Stewart. We've got Frank Field, we've got Digby Jones weighing in on the side. No, OK. But the truth is, I take Paul's point, but the reality is the only way the British people have a choice between those two models is if we're outside of the EU. So I totally understand that people will feel differently on the left in relation to things like the Working Time Directive, but they don't get a say at all unless we're outside.
Dominic, Raab, isn't it true that actually this is less about the merits or not of remaining or leaving the EU and much more that viewers have become spectators in an internecine war in the Conservative Party?
Well, you could say the same about on the left.
No,
you've got unions.
No, it's not the same as the blue on blue.
I mean, do you seriously think that Jeremy Corbyn
I only have to list
left, right, and centre for not being passionate enough about it? It doesn't look like Jeremy Corbyn's heart's in it. But the truth is,
that's a good deflection. But let's just come back to it. Has been as a result of a split in the Conservative Party. You must accept that.
No, I don't. I think that there are different views in the Labour Party on both sides, different views in the Tory Party. And do you know what? The average person watching this show probably thinks that's quite healthy.
The overwhelming majority of the Labour movement is absolutely behind continuing with our membership because they think it's best for our security, for our jobs, for our prosperity. I have to say, one thing I would ask viewers to consider. Michael Gove, picture behind Paul there, it's kind of weird seeing the two of them next to each other like that, you know, is doing this speech from the position of being a champion of democracy. And one of the things that's very curious, he has a lot to say about democracy when it comes to the EU, but very little to say about our democracy here, where you can get into government with less than 25% of the support of registered electors. Well, it just illustrates, does this guy really care about democracy, or is there something else?
All right, well, let's talk about that briefly before I let these two go. Paul Mason, Jeremy Corbyn's conversion, the journey from the last referendum to this one, is it credible?
I think it's credible, because Jeremy Corbyn...
Does he really believe?
Well, he's attempting to lead a party, number one, and I think you can't criticise him for not trying to build consensus in his party. And like me, I mean, there are many people in the Labour movement who are sceptical of Europe. I'm sceptical mainly on democracy and free movement, OK? But the choice will be on the 23rd whether or not to hand over to Boris and Michael Gove. And they could have come and said, let's do something, let's create the debate about the future Britain outside Europe beforehand, but they didn't. Right. And that's been their choice. And it's clearer and clearer this week, actually, that that's not their choice.
I'm going to have to stop it there. I'm afraid we're going to have to do security. I promised I'd come back to it, and I didn't.
We'll come back and do another time.
You'll come back when you're invited. Now,